Thanks so much for joining today's briefing on the Paris Agreement and a fair fossil fuel wind down. We have a great group gathered, and I see that some folks are logging in. Welcome. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Just a few logistical notes before we get started. Please keep your audio muted. You can also post any questions that you have in the Q&A throughout the discussion. And we do have a Spanish-English interpretation available today that you can take advantage of by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. There's a white globe that says interpretation. And when you click on that, you can go ahead and select the language of your choice, either Spanish or English. And thank you, Pamela, for interpreting today. This event is being recorded, and it'll be available on fossilfueltreaty.org. And if you have any technical questions, you can send us an email at info@climateaccess.org. It's up there on the screen, info@climateaccess.org for any technical Zoom questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Sephora Berman. Sephora is the International Program Director at Stand.Earth and the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Steering Committee. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sephora.
Thank you, Meredith, and welcome everyone. With the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement approaching on December 15th, it's important to assess how much progress has been made and the ways in which climate ambition needs to be heightened. So much progress has been made, but unfortunately, governments and countries around the world are still expanding fossil fuel production at rates that will lock in catastrophic levels of warming. It's an absolute imperative that these trends start shifting. Renewed international cooperation is required to shift these trends and wind down fossil fuel production in an equitable manner, where wealthy fossil fuel producing countries lead and support nations dependent on fossil fuels with less capacity to make an energy and economic transition. Today, we're joined by a group of leaders from around the world here to discuss how to wind down fossil fuel production at levels consistent with the Paris Agreement limit of 1.5 degrees of warming, with equity at the core of the effort. I'm going to introduce our panelists now, and we'll start by asking the panel a series of questions before opening it up to your questions. As a reminder, you can post your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. There is also a small globe where you can click English or Spanish. There will be translation during the event. Our speakers include Gregorio Mirabal. He is the General Coordinator of the Congress of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin. He is a Curapaco Indigenous leader from Venezuela and founding member of the United Multi-Ethnic People of Amazonas Indigenous Movement. Mohamed Adow, founding director of PowerShift Africa, steering committee member of the Treaty Initiative and regional expert. Mohamed has worked for 18 years in the international development and environmental sectors, specializing in climate justice and clean energy. Meena Raman is legal advisor for the Third World Network. Meena currently coordinates the climate change program and has been actively involved in the intergovernmental climate negotiations from Bali to Madrid. She's been monitoring and reporting on the negotiations and providing analysis and support, both to developing country governments as well as to civil society participants. Loukina Tille is a young climate activist. She's been affiliated with Switzerland Climate Strike, Patagonia Action Works, and Year of Youth Activism, and many more movements. Bill McKibben is founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org, and author of The End of Nature, among other books, and regular periodicals in outlets like The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Aveta Gerasimchuk leads the Sustainable Energy Supplies activities at IASD's Energy Program and its Global Subsidies Initiative. She was a senior advisor, head of the Trade and Investment Program at WWF Russia, and leading research fellow at the Institute for Natural Resource Economics and Environmental Policy at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Mitzi Jonelle is the co-founder of Youth Advocates for Climate Action, the Fridays for the Future of Philippines, and part of the Fridays for the Future International Community. Mark Campanale is the founder and executive chairman of the Carbon Tracker Initiative, and conceived the unburnable carbon capital markets thesis. Prior to this, Mark spent several decades working for major institutional asset management companies. Finally, Hannah McKinnon is the Energy Futures and Transition Program Director at Oil Change International. She's worked in climate change and energy issues for over a decade, working with Climate Action Network, Environmental Defense Canada, climate adaptation and risk management in Central America, and more. So an incredible panel. Let's get started. Let's start with the production gap. Aveta, your organization, along with the UNEP, Stockholm Environment Institute, and others, identified the need for a 6% reduction in fossil fuel production annually through to 2030 in the recently released 2020 Production Gap Report. Can you explain how this percentage was determined and where countries are moving in this direction, particularly in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you, Zipporah. I'm going to use a couple of slides for the answer to your questions. I hope you can all see my shared screen now. The Production Gap Report is now released for the second year by a group of research organizations and UN Environment Program to highlight the concept we introduced, the production gap, which signifies a discrepancy between governments' plans and projections with respect to extraction of fossil fuels and climate targets. And we look at both what is required in terms of emission reductions according to the IPCC modeling and countries' own commitments in terms of nationally determined contributions. So in both cases, there is a wide gap. You can see it here in the slide. And it shows the dichotomy, the dissonance between what governments say in terms of climate mitigation and the ambition to extract still more oil, gas, and coal. We model the trajectory for consistent decrease of fossil fuel production as the need to reduce extraction of fossil fuels by 6% every year between now and 2030. But in reality, what we see is that governments plan to increase their production by 2% every year. And by 2030, that will result in the double amount of extraction, which is consistent with 1.5 degrees. Moreover, we have also highlighted in this year's Production Gap Report the implications of the COVID crisis. You can see in the graph there is a slight bump in this or decrease in this trajectory. So there is a 7% drop in extraction projected for this year, but the business as usual scenario still put it back on track for overshooting the safe climate targets in future years. And moreover, what we have seen is that with recovery packages still supporting business as usual, still a lot of money going to fossil fuels. There is more risk now in carbon lock-in, and there is, despite the rhetoric, not enough action on clean energy projects. We also use the data from the Energy Policy Tracker, set up as a network of research organizations looking at recovery packages in different countries. And here you can see in gray the commitments to fossil fuels in terms of funding that came out this year, and in green commitments for clean energy. We see that there is still much more funding going to support fossil fuel intensive activities. At the level of G20, it's $230 billion already committed at the very least, compared with 50% less for clean energy in recovery packages. And unfortunately, we see like the plans that are still being announced continue this trend. So we make several recommendations. I'm not going to go in detail on these recommendations right now at the outset of our press conference, but clearly we are way off track for meeting safe climate targets. And also we need to use the moment of recovery to break this bad habit and to ensure that stimulus funds support a sustainable recovery and we avoid future carbon lock-in. Thank you. I will be happy to answer more questions later.
Thank you very much, Iveta. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please put them there. We will be getting to them shortly. Please also note that there is a small globe at the bottom of your screen. Please choose English or Spanish. Our next speaker will be speaking in Spanish. We're very honored today to have Gregorio Mirabal, the General Coordinator of the Congress of Indigenous Organizations from the Amazon Basin. Of course, the Amazon Basin is one of the places where we are seeing an expansion of oil extraction, despite the data in the production gap report, and despite the fact that it is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet and critically important to stabilize global climate. Gregorio, fossil fuels and climate change have disproportionately impact those living in the front lines of production. Can you share your perspective with us on how Indigenous nations in the Amazon have been affected by oil development and what you would like to see in terms of countries increasing their ambition to act on climate change?
Un gran saludo a todos los presentes. Agradecer a la hermana Sépora por esta invitación a la COICA, a la Coordinadora de Organizaciones Indígenas de la Cuenca Amazónica, que representamos 511 pueblos indígenas, 66 pueblos indígenas en aislamiento voluntario. Nuestro ecosistema en este momento representa casi el 50% del territorio de América Latina, de Sudamérica, y el 5% de la superficie terrestre mundial. Nuestros bosques concentran más del 10% de la biodiversidad del planeta, el 15% del agua dulce del planeta y el 53%, casi el 60% de los bosques tropicales del planeta. Allí está la COICA, ahí estamos nosotros como COICA. Y agradecemos a todos los que están aquí presentando la gran amenaza que representan los combustibles fósiles para el planeta y especialmente para nosotros, los pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía. Presentando su preocupación para revivir un acuerdo que cumple 5 años, que es el Acuerdo de París, que solo está en el papel, que no están cumpliendo con los objetivos y la ambición climática que se planteó hace 5 años. Y por eso estamos aquí, por nuestra preocupación ante la necesidad de un plan para cumplir los objetivos, para salvar el planeta y para salvar la Amazonía. Nuestro reto desde la Amazonía es salvar la madre selva amazónica. Es el reto ambiental que es la misma ambición que ustedes tienen, porque lo que pasa en la Amazonía tendrá un impacto positivo o negativo. En este momento es negativo, porque los territorios indígenas de la Amazonía están concesionados. Lamentablemente, el extractivismo, el petróleo, el gas, la minería, la ganadería intensiva, los monocultivos, están destruyendo los territorios indígenas en la Amazonía. Entonces, 2018, 2019 y ahora con la pandemia, eso se ha acelerado mucho más rápido. Derrames petroleros en Ecuador, territorios indígenas, derrames petroleros en Colombia, en Perú. Ligado a la pandemia, se han otorgado más licencias ambientales para el petróleo, para el gas, para las carreteras, para la infraestructura. Y realmente parece que los gobiernos de Sudamérica solo piensan en la reactivación económica en base al extractivismo. Nosotros en este momento estamos exigiendo que protejan los territorios que todavía no han sido intervenidos, que protejan el agua que todavía está debajo de la tierra, está circulando en nuestros territorios, el aire, el bosque, la biodiversidad que todavía está viva. Pero nosotros estamos diciendo que hay que volver a la tierra, que hay que dejar el petróleo debajo de los bosques, debajo de nuestros territorios. Pero los gobiernos están diciendo más concesiones petroleras, más concesiones mineras, más concesiones de gas, de carretera, de infraestructura. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer? Estamos preocupados. Pedimos un apoyo desde aquí porque el financiamiento viene de Estados Unidos, de los bancos de Europa, de los bancos de China, de los bancos de Rusia. De allí viene el dinero para destruir la Amazonía. De allí vienen las decisiones para destruir el bosque tropical más grande del planeta, para destruir nuestra casa, donde están nuestros pueblos. Entonces, esta lucha depende de ustedes también, que nuestra voz llegue a Europa, a China, a Rusia, a Estados Unidos, que haya un nuevo pacto para una transición, parar las energías fósiles, parar los combustibles fósiles, parar el extractivismo y buscar una nueva alternativa que respete la naturaleza, que permita que la naturaleza, que el bosque tropical amazónico, que nuestros pueblos tengan la garantía que el bosque va a estar de pie, que el agua va a estar limpia, que los combustibles fósiles queden debajo de la tierra, como tiene que ser, como ha sido siempre. Pero para eso necesitamos un cambio a nivel de los bancos, a nivel de la toma de decisiones, a nivel de los gobiernos, porque nuestros gobiernos en Sudamérica solo producen materia prima para Europa, para China, para Rusia, solo materia prima. Y la única materia prima que mandan es el oro, petróleo, gas e inversiones e infraestructura. Eso es lo único que hace nuestro gobierno. Y no hay una protección a los derechos de la naturaleza, a los derechos del bosque, de la selva amazónica, a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, nuestros llamados es que nos unamos a esta lucha, pero con propuestas también. Necesitamos que ese 55% de nuestros bosques tropicales que le dan aire al mundo, que le dan agua al mundo, se protejan. Que tengan un valor económico, pero para que no sean destruidos. Una economía que no destruya a los bosques tropicales. Una economía que no destruya la biodiversidad. Que no nos ponga en un proceso de extinción, que ya estamos en un punto de no retorno. Nuestra vida, la vida de los bosques tropicales, y estamos viendo que son los combustibles fósiles y una economía que solo quiere tragarse la selva amazónica, la quiere destruir y destruir a sus pueblos. Un gran abrazo a todos y que sigamos luchando por un presente y por un futuro para nosotros y para los que vienen detrás de nosotros. Gracias.
Gracias, Gregorio. Thank you so much. We will return with questions. much strength to your communities who we know have been not only dealing with COVID in these last months, but also the floods and the oil spills. And we're grateful for you joining us today. I want to turn now to Mohamed Adow from PowerShift Africa. Mohamed, can you explain why the Paris Agreement hasn't addressed the production gap? And why do we need a renewed cooperation to close that gap? We can't hear Mohamed. I can't hear Mohamed. Can others tell me?
No,
Loukina,
Mohamed, we're not getting your audio.
I think you got it. I think I heard something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Sorry about that. So the current global efforts are insufficient to achieve the Paris climate goals and to stabilize, global heating to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. While it's true that since, Paris Agreement was agreed 5 years ago, progress on low carbon solutions has accelerated across the world, and that the world may now be moving in the right direction towards zero carbon future, we still have a problem. And the problem is that the energy transition is not happening fast enough to stop dangerous climate change and to save the people that have done the least to cause the climate crisis. Unfortunately, in Paris, national governments largely turned a blind eye to the downsides of fossil fuels and instead focused on emission cuts. As a result, the current low climate ambition is putting the world on a pathway to over 3 degrees of warming. So the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement can play a role, but must be complemented with specific measures to address fossil fuels, which the Paris Agreement did not specifically address. Great as the Paris Agreement is, it does not provide a framework fit for purpose to address the specific problems arising from the fossil fuel system at the scale and speed required to prevent overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius and enable an orderly and just transition for all countries. In fact, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement leave scope for fossil fuel expansion. And so it's time we close this gap. We can't afford to continue to be blindsided by the unprecedented danger posed by coal, oil, and gas expansion across the world. The fossil fuel industry plans to produce enough fossil fuels to far exceed the Paris climate goals. We are already seeing a new scramble for African oil and gas. So a major turning point is required to shift attention towards the implementation of concrete near-term actions and renewed international cooperation. And central to this effort is facing down fossil fuels and transitioning towards renewable energy globally at scale. To close the ambition gap, we must stop the proliferation of fossil fuels and support new international cooperation that allows us to phase down production in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius and at the same time enable a just transition for every worker, community, and country. This weekend, the UK will be hosting a virtual climate ambition summit of world leaders where Boris Johnson is going to be urging other nations to follow his lead and commit to new emissions reduction plans ahead of the big UN gathering next year in Glasgow, which we know will determine global progress in tackling the climate emergency. But one thing you don't know is that behind the scenes, Mr. Johnson is playing with fire. Through the UK Export Finance, they are considering using UK taxpayers' money to give financial backing to the East Africa crude oil pipeline. This week, reports have surfaced that the UK Export Finance, which uses state funds to underwrite projects where UK exporters are involved, was considering supporting the 870-mile heated pipeline, which will snake across East Africa, threatening local people and the habitats of elephants, lions, chimpanzees. And we know the carbon emissions of the oil that will be carried will actually be the same as all UK flights every year. So while leaders, calling in this weekend will be forgiven for feeling like the UK is acting like a drug dealing rehab therapist. And this is true for all other polluting powers. So it's not limited to just the UK, but all other polluting powers. As a Kenyan, I'm shocked to see a country which claims to be an ally, our ally, and tells the world it's a green leader, having a two-faced approach to climate policy. And this hypocrisy, this dissonance, is not addressed in the Paris Agreement, which is why we need a new international cooperation to actively push against fossil fuels and accelerate the transition to renewables. I'll tell you, like a gardener, we don't need to water the flowers of renewable energy. We need to actively pull out the fossil fuel weeds as well. That is why we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, Zipporah.
And just while I have you, Mohamed, could you explain to those who have joined us just very briefly the outline of the treaty?
Yeah. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty aims to foster a global, equitable transition away from fossil fuels to clean, low-carbon energy and economies. Our campaign aims to spur international cooperation to end the development of fossil fuels, phase out existing production within the agreed climate limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then develop plans to support workers, communities, and countries that are dependent on fossil fuels so that we can create, secure and healthy livelihoods. 50 years ago, nations came together to face another global threat, the proliferation of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. They agreed to stop new production of arms, they agreed to reduce existing stockpiles, and they agreed to promote peaceful technologies via the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Climate change, like nuclear weapons, is an existential threat. In fact, today, climate action failure is a greater global risk than weapons of mass destruction. The IPCC has said that the world has a decade to take decisive action. To limit warming to below 1.5 degrees requires emissions reductions of 45% by 2030 and zero emissions by 2050. But you know what? Fossil fuels account for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of carbon dioxide emissions. And the fossil fuel industry is planning to produce about 50% more fossil fuels by 2030 than will be consistent with a 2-degree pathway. And 2-degree pathway is not safe for the continent of Africa, neither is it safe for the vulnerable countries in the small island states. But when you look at what they're planning, that will actually be more than 120% what is consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. And so for the world to remain within the Paris climate limits, what we're proposing through the treaty is something that will help the world actually phase down the production of coal, oil, and gas so that we can be able to attain what Paris agreed. So what we're putting forward is an international cooperation that plays a central role in winding down fossil fuel production so that we can actually realize what Paris Agreement calls for. So our proposal is actually an accompaniment to what was agreed in 2015, and in fact actually fills the gap so that we can actually help realize the Paris Agreement, but more importantly, the UNFCCC Convention, which is the climate constitution that the whole world agreed in 1992, but failed to actually honor it.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. As a Canadian, I've struggled with this dilemma as well. Our government is acting on climate change and believes in climate change and is expanding oil and gas production as well. And we constantly get this argument that, well, no country could do it alone. But I think you've explained very clearly, therefore, why we need a fossil fuel treaty. I want to turn now to Loukina. Loukina, the youth movement's position on fossil fuels has always recognized the need to phase out fossil fuels with calls to keep it in the ground, and to foster a just transition in alignment with 1.5. Can you share what Fridays for the Future groups are calling for as the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement approaches?
Yes. So Fridays for Future groups are calling for actions, because the last 5 years have been a lot of awareness and words, but now the next 5 years have to be years of climate action. And currently we have 114 actions planned in 27 countries. And we will light up some candles and form the words "Fight for 1.5." It's not a birthday party nor a celebration. We put light on the climate inaction of world leaders. And I just want to read you a bit of the promise that we wrote as a promise to fight for the 1.5 degrees target. So 5 years ago, on December 12, 2015, world leaders agreed on the Paris Agreement. By doing so, they made a promise to the world, to those at front lines, and to all future generations, to tackle the climate emergency and limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. Since then, leaders worldwide have still failed to treat the climate crisis as a crisis. After 5 years, we understand that there is clearly no point in simply asking our leaders to live up to the promise they made in Paris. It's time for us to make our own promises. So we are calling to everyone to sign this promise to fight for 1.5 degree. And you can find the promise and all information on Fridays for Future website. You just click Fridays for Future website on internet and you will find it, and all information with it. And for us young people, 2 degrees is absolutely not an option. So the candles we will light tomorrow, we are also like a reminder that we should never stop the fight for people now who are already suffering, and for the next generations, of course. And as we shouted loud at every strikes, keep it in the ground, we totally understand the necessity of planning a just transition out of the fossil fuel industry. Because like fossil fuels, as Mohamed said very clearly before, are weapons of mass destruction for our generation. And as the youth, we will just keep acting against them and respect our own promise to fight for the 1.5 and stay below 1.5 degrees.
Thank you so much.
We are also organizing some webinars tomorrow as well. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Loukina. Mitzi, can you share some the efforts underway in the Philippines to resist fossil fuel expansion, and what Fridays for the Future has planned in your region?
So my home, the Philippines, experienced the strongest typhoon on the planet this year. I am afraid of drowning in my own bedroom, and it's not fair because all this is avoidable if only the fossil fuel industry, who have known for decades about the crisis, decided to choose people over profit. I and so many others are paying the consequences for greed of fossil fuel industries, and Filipinos are drowning. And each day that the world leaders of carbon majors refuse to phase out fossil fuel is a stone tied to our bodies, dragging us down. But we refuse to stay silent and be silenced. Young people in the Philippines and in our region and across the world are standing up, demanding that fossil fuels stay in the ground. This Friday, we will be holding protests across the world, as Loukina already mentioned, to demand that we limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know that this is not possible if we don't phase out fossil fuels. In the Philippines, the Department of Energy already declared that we will be having a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants, and this is a victory for the climate movement in the Philippines. Now we just have to remind them that they have to make it official and they have to actually start implementing it as soon as possible, but we have hope for this. The responsibility, however, for action lies with wealthy fossil fuel producing nations, the global north countries, the imperialist countries who are also leading the environmental plunder in our lands. Now carbon major countries must take responsibility of the historical injustices we've faced and lead the world away from oil, gas, and coal, so we can have a safe present, so we can have a chance to live. We are fed up and we're saying enough to far off targets and waving around net zero like a magical wand, but not having any concrete plans how to get there. To celebrate this is a slap to our face. I do not want a net zero target or future if that means monoculture plantations where indigenous and ancestral land is stolen. I do not want a net zero target or future if that means small farmers are displaced for solar panels and farms. I do not want a net zero target if fisher folk lose their livelihood because of this. We need annual binding carbon targets, and we need to phase out the fossil fuel industry and have a just transition. The future that we are fighting for leaves no one behind. We need development for all, and we cannot forget our workers, the backbone of our society. You will tell me that this is unrealistic, that I am dreaming too much. My question to you is, why are we compromising on our future? Why are we compromising on our survival? The youth have united as a global movement, and we will not stop. So carbon major leaders, listen to us. Phase out fossil fuels and leave this rotten industry behind, and with the workers leading the way, begin the just transition. And to the fossil fuel industry, brace yourselves, because your time is over. We demand justice.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. And the perfect introduction to our next speaker, in fact. Bill McKibben, investors, corporations, and governments are moving their money out of oil, gas, and coal at staggering rates. Some incredible news yesterday out of New York. Can you give us an overview of the trends and also why international cooperation is needed to compel others to follow those out ahead?
Yeah, first of all, Sephora, many thanks for organizing this, and what a privilege to get to be with everybody else on this call. Look, it's very clear that for many years we've faced a failure of governance around climate change, and our nations have not risen to the occasion. Paris is as close as they've come, and we will keep working hard on them to live up to the promises made there. But there are other important players in this world beyond governments, and they include big financial powers, which is why people have been pushing very hard to get banks and asset managers and insurance companies and everybody else on board. You know that this divestment movement has become the largest corporate campaign of its kind in history. Yesterday, we had the largest single pension fund yet to join in, one of the largest pension funds on earth, New York State's Employees Pension Fund, $226 billion, really signal victory along this way. And what it's demonstrating is, and much of this work is, of course, thanks to the guidance that Mark Campanale gave early on, that people who are grappling with the financial bottom line of this crisis have come to understand just what the future holds. I want to underscore, however, what people have been saying here today. I mean, we talk glibly about 2050 or about our various targets or whatever it is, it's really important to just step back and acknowledge what terrible shape we're in right now, and the temperature's only gone up about a degree. We've just had 30 storms in the Atlantic Basin this hurricane season. The last two of them slammed into Central America, and the damage they did there was so horrific that it's almost beyond our ability to describe. The estimates are that the equivalent, maybe the equivalent of 40% of the GDP of Honduras that disappeared in the course of those two storms. Hundreds of thousands of people already on the move as a result. We're in a great emergency, and so we need to act very fast. And since one of the things that we're here to talk about today is this treaty, just worth reminding ourselves that it was in the throes of the great emergency at the end of World War II, when we saw the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the world nerved itself up to start trying to figure out how to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Well, we're seeing that same scale of damage. Every day, the carbon that we put in the atmosphere traps the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. And so it is high time, and I am so grateful to the people who've been doing this work to get this treaty off the ground, for us to understand that though it's easy to visualize the explosion of a few nuclear weapons and the damage they would cause, it turns out you can do just as much damage with the explosion of a billion pistons inside a billion cylinders every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And that's where we are right now, with the need for really emergency action. 2050 is not an interesting year. 2030 is an interesting year. It may be the last really interesting year in this fight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bill. So we've talked a little bit about some of the commitments we're hearing as people talk about increased ambition this week on the anniversary of the Paris Agreement. We heard Mitzi and Loukina also mention these net zero commitments, and you know, Bill has talked about what we're seeing in the financial community. We've heard many oil majors and other fossil fuel companies saying, that's okay, we're committed to net zero. We can still expand production and be in line with net zero. Hannah McKibben, at the Climate Ambition Summit, countries are being encouraged to commit to develop net zero strategies. I know you and the researchers at Oil Change International have done some significant work looking at the fossil fuel sector's pledges and how that relates to the conversation today. Can you tell us a little bit about the potential of CCS and what you're seeing in those net zero commitments?
Thanks, Deb. And thank you so much for having me. What an incredible and inspiring group of people to follow. Yeah, this is, I mean, I'm always struck when we talk about Paris, when we reflect back on the fact that it doesn't mention oil, coal, or gas. And that's, you know, an incredible oversight in the world's largest climate agreement, of course. But I think that one thing we can think about in this group is it is movements that have shone a spotlight on the sector and really not let these things fall off the agenda. And I think that what that's done is it has put the fossil fuel sector in a position where they recognize, like, oh, if we're not saying something on climate, if we're not starting to talk about this, we will lose any last shred of social license we have. And so over the past year, couple of years perhaps, we started to see these commitments coming fast and furiously from the oil majors. And I mean, this is one of those images where a picture speaks more than the words, but we looked at the climate commitments from a number of the oil and gas majors, and it's a sea of red. And that is, red represents grossly inadequate vis-a-vis what needs to happen to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which, as we've already heard, is already beyond what is a safe climate for, you know, populations, vulnerable populations around the world. And so what you can pull a few things out of this, and we looked at a number of criteria, and you know, there are report cards are often a common tool, and often they compare things to each other. This really compared what is on the table from the oil and gas sector to the 1.5 degree and limits, and what we see is that there's no one that's passing muster from this perspective. And I think I would just lean into a couple of points that have already been made in this conversation, which is, this is the decade that matters. You know, net zero targets by mid-century are only as good as what companies, governments, investors are doing in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years. Between now and 2030 is when we're going to make or break the safety of our future climate. And here we see across the board that most of these oil and gas companies are planning significant expansion of their production well beyond 2030, with a couple of exceptions where you see slight declines, but it's still nowhere close to where it needs to be. And on the next slide, and to your other point, Zipporah, another thing that the sector leans relentlessly on is the promise of the future of carbon capture and storage, these technological unicorns that they've been talking about for decades now. They've been investing in for decades, and they've never materialized at the scale that would be required or within the, the economic viability that you would need to make these types of things possible at scale. And it really is just another delay tactic from a sector that is going to hold on as tightly as it can to its business model for as long as we let it. And that's why, the people that we're hearing from in this conversation and the work that the incredible movements are doing around the world to confront infrastructure at the front lines or policy or investors to challenge them to stand up to this sector is so critical. And I think, the one other thing I'll say is this paints a clear picture of why governments need to step in. There's no way these companies are going to manage their own decline. If we want a transition that is truly just, that's truly equitable, and that's led by the countries and regions that have the most responsibility for causing it, we need our governments to step in and do that.
Thank you, Hannah. We're almost through our speakers. We have two more that I want to ask critical questions to, and then we have a couple more questions in the chat that people haven't gotten to, though I've noticed we have such an incredible panel here today that many of the questions coming up we are covering in our conversation. Meena, Hannah just spoke about the importance of why we need equity and just transition in this conversation of who continues to produce and how much. And of course, we know that countries are not equally responsible for emissions, nor are they in the same position to wind down fossil fuel production and accelerate the transition. Can you give us some examples of how countries in the global south are being impacted by fossil fuel dependence, particularly in light of COVID? And what's needed to move away from fossil fuels? How can the fossil fuel treaty play a role?
Thank you very much, Zipporah. I think first, my name is actually Meena Raman. It's not the ramen. I still see R-A-M-E-N, so that's the noodle, but I'm not the noodle. Greetings to you, and I'm coming from Malaysia. I think what's really critical is that, as others have also said, the difficulty that we are facing and why the Paris Agreement was actually quite weak, and why governments could not muster the political will to go in the right direction in terms of really addressing fossil fuels head on, clearly represents the fact that many of the governments actually were unable to do that, largely because of the influence of the fossil fuel industry, precisely in the UNFCCC space. And corporate players play a very big role, and they are in the front line of much of these negotiations, and we are aware of that. But this principle of the Paris Agreement is very dear to many developing countries, and that's the common but differentiated responsibility. The point that those who actually cause the historical emissions and the cumulative emissions, for which many of the world, what Mitzi was talking about in terms of Philippines and the frequent hurricanes and all the damage that we see around the world, we are all aware of the fact that that this has happened because of history. And so in order for us to really move, for us, we need to understand that any treaty initiative has to be based on an equitable principle, one that is just. We completely agree that this is imperative in terms of focusing on the fossil fuel producers on the supply side, because we have been missing that piece. There has to be a global phase down, but it must be within a framework that is just. Just to give you an example, many of the developing world, like mine included. I mean, I come from Malaysia, middle income country, very famous for Petronas, our petroleum, you see Formula One and you know Petronas. It's a big company. Now it's a state-owned company. 20% of the government revenue, we're talking about government revenue, it's not about about Petronas's revenue, but Petronas contributes to 20% of our government's revenue. Now, this is quite a big thing. And it's not just for Malaysia, it's also the same for many oil-dependent countries, whether we talk of Ecuador, whether we talk of Venezuela, whether we talk about the Middle East. Now, many years ago, when I was a young climate activist in the UNFCCC space, I was challenged. Why am I talking to Saudi Arabia? Why am I engaging with the Gulf countries? Aren't they the culprits and aren't they the problem? And I ask myself, I mean, for those of us who come from the developing world, we have absolutely no choice but to engage with our governments to ensure that while we understand where the source of the problem is, that we need to find the way in which to solve the problem, so that we engage with them to make the transition and the diversification happen, the move away to happen. It's not going to happen just because somebody's dreaming about it. The treaty is not going to happen overnight. There is no political will at this time in our we see the pandemic, the global pandemic, trillions of stimulus packages going in the wrong direction. Many countries reeling with economic crisis at the moment, not being able to cope with the pandemic. The UNCTAD recently estimated $2.5 trillion that developing countries are facing, many going into a debt crisis. So the rich world may have options, but we don't have an option from the developing world as civil society here. We have to engage with the reality. We have to talk to Petronas. We have to talk to our government. We have to engage with the Gulf countries. So how do you make the shift happen? And so many of us have been looking to the hard reality and the sobering reality that the time has come for us no longer to depend on fossil fuels for the revenue. This is not Shell, this is not Total, this is not Chevron, but it's about real change that needs to happen in our country. So we are responsible for that. But the final thing I would say here is that many people say, keep oil in the ground, keep coal in the hole. I used to say, add one more phrase, and that is put money in the fund. This is only going to happen with finance of a massive kind, financial flows that will have to happen. Mohamed talked about the renewable energy transition, the massive, so that countries don't have to repeat what the rich world has done. But I'm so shocked that the rich countries like Germany or Norway, they're still stuck in fossil fuel expansion. I mean, we know the US, we don't have to talk about that, and Canada, as you say. But if the rich world doesn't show the example, how on earth are you going to expect the poor world to move in that direction when fossil fuel dependence is quite large in terms of government revenue? And that's the challenge that we face. And so we are happy to be in this network because I think there's a lot of hard data, hard research. There is a very good paper by Greg Mutit and Sivan Kartar talking about equity, climate justice, and fossil fuel extraction. How can we do this in a just framework? A treaty has to be within an equity and just perspective. Otherwise, it has no chance to move forward. So we look forward to working with all of you in a lot more enhanced way. And just the final point about all this net zero. I mean, it's just bunkum. It's just delays. It's more nonsense. Don't fall into this net zero rubbish, because we are seeing that Shell is knocking on the doors of my country, going into forest areas, indigenous peoples. And these are the new carbon cowboys who come and say that we want to buy credits from you while you absorb the emissions that they are putting out. I mean, even scientifically, it's flawed methodology. So anybody who is going to stay at the Climate Ambition Summit and believe these net zero targets, my final message is don't be fooled again. You can fool some people sometime, but you can't fool us, because the truth is out. And we know that the carbon markets are not going to solve the problem, nor is carbon offsets. So thank you, Zipporah.
Thank you very much, Meena. I was reflecting on these net zero commitments and reviewing the data on what it would take in order to do so-called nature-based solutions and carbon removal at the scale that people are talking about to expand fossil fuel production, and thinking that the oil companies have gone from this age of denial to an age of delusion. You know, we would, as you know, in the scenarios, have to plant an area the size of India twice every year, and then harvest it, and then put the carbon, sequester that carbon. When I asked experts at Madrid, how much of this do we do today if we need to do that much? They said we don't. So there's this crazy fallacy that we can continue to expand production, but I think this panel has made very clear where we can't. Finally, Mark, I'd like to turn to you to address the role of the markets in a fossil fuel wind down, and this question of a fair energy and economic transition, including the limitations of the markets. For many years, we have heard governments are responsible for emissions, and the markets will deal with production and constraining production in line with Paris goals. But that's not working. It's not working fast enough. Certainly, can you speak to this issue of the role in markets in the decline of and the wind down of fossil fuels?
Thanks, Sephora, and thank you for everyone for dialing in today. It's a good point, and markets, investors, private corporations, they look to governments to give stability, to give certainty, to create the rules around which they can operate. I don't want to give you the impression that I speak to ex-chief exec of major banks all the time, but I've just come off a call with the recently retired chief exec of one of the world's largest banks, and we had a good hour talking. And his point he made to me is that the world is facing two choices. One of, we continue as we are, expanding fossil fuel production with businesses that are completely misaligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, as we've heard from Hannah. And we'll head down into a disorderly transition, chaos. We'll have dislocated markets, pension funds not meeting their liabilities because the value of their assets have collapsed, catastrophe free from fire and damage, insurance markets trying to absorb fire losses and water losses with no chance. So we have this rather dystopian view, or there is the other approach that we can take, which is an orderly and managed transition and decline. Now, the problem, this is where my conversation with this ex-CEO, who was actually very encouraging to us for all of our work, because the bankers are listening, let's be clear, whether it's a divestment movement or interventions that are being made through regulators, is that we to enhance this managed decline, we need the certainty of governments working together to agree the retirement of licenses and the retirement of mining permits within 1.5 degrees, which is why I personally, after over a decade working with Carbon Tracker in our work, believe that we need a collective common agreement, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that retires those licenses. And I'm thrilled that in just the last week, Denmark, which is Europe's largest producer of oil and gas, has decided to cancel all future oil and gas production licenses. There'll be no more licensing rounds. And we need to take their leadership and join it with other similar nations to make similar announcements. Now, the problem that we have, and one of the companies that was in the schedule that Hannah talked about, BP, they've announced a production cut of 30% to 40% of their planned production, but they're going it alone. And what we need is the corporations and governments working and traveling together. We need the BPs and the Danish government, followed by other leading nations and corporations, to agree a collective agreement to retire, to ensure that we don't head off into this catastrophe. So that's what markets are looking for, Sephora, certainty and a treaty or an agreement to retire the fossil fuel industry in time gives markets that certainty, gives markets that clarity that they're looking for.
Thank you, Mark. And that's really clear. While I have you, one of the questions that we've seen in the Q&A, I know you're from the UK, is around what can the UK do, or what could people in the UK do relative to what we've heard about the expansion in Africa?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we know the UK Export Finance is looking like it's going to support that. It's completely inconsistent with the obligations or the commitments that the UK government is making. And we have this rather strange situation of the last green hurrah, where Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, is talking up the green agenda, which he should be talking about net zero commitments and carbon reduction commitments. But to be consistent, not only the UK, but the UK government should use the COP as the opportunity in Glasgow next year to bring nations together to talk about the other important side of the coin, not just the green, but the need to retire the fossil fuel industry. As we've spoken about today, the Paris Climate Agreement does not talk about fossil fuels at all. It's an emissions reduction treaty. It's not a fossil fuel constraint treaty. That's potentially its strength, but also its fundamental flaw. And what the UK government should be doing is creating a platform along with the Danish government, maybe with Kamala Harris under the Biden administration, opening this discussion that brings the fossil fuel leading producing countries together to agree this plan map. That's what the UK government should be leading. And we've already started to speak to a few thought makers, and those who know UK politics will know that Bernard Jenkins is no socialist. He's the leading member of the Conservative Party who tweeted just recently his support for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So this can go cross-party. It doesn't have to be seen within a particular political lens. I think any serious person thinking about the issue would conclude naturally that we need to tackle the problem of overproduction of fossil fuels through some kind of agreement. We could do it in Glasgow. Let's work towards Glasgow to make that happen.
Thank you. And just of note for reporters on the line, we have already seen many cities starting to step up and endorse the concept of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. The city of Vancouver endorsed last month unanimously, the first city in the world, followed quickly by motions tabled in New York, Los Angeles, and there'll be a motion tabled in Barcelona in a couple of weeks. We are almost out of time. We have a couple of more questions. We've talked a lot about the moment that we're in, and we've heard a lot about the stimulus that has gone to fossil fuel companies during the COVID era. What we know from the impacts already that people are seeing in their daily lives is that our world is on fire, and we can build back better by throwing more fuel on that fire, which is why we're having this discussion about the role and urgent need to constrain expansion of production of fossil fuels in order to achieve the Paris Agreement. Gregorio, I'd like to go back to you before we end. This question of how do we build back better? Would you have some additional reflections for decision makers who will be gathering on the 5th anniversary of Paris at the Climate Summit this weekend?
I believe that Gregorio may no longer be with us on the webinar.
Just checking. We may have lost Gregorio. We have a lot of people from all over the world, and speaking from the heart of the Amazon is not easy. I'm going to go then and take a couple of other questions that we're seeing in the chat. Okay. There's some questions about how the international cooperation could work. What are the next steps in addressing the need for a fossil fuel treaty? And what is it important for governments to do? Mark, I'm wondering maybe if you could take this moment to speak about the need and the issues around the global registry of fossil fuel production. I know I was shocked when I found out that governments are not accountable anywhere for listing what production is planned of fossil fuels or adding it up globally. And so maybe you could speak to that as one of the next steps in achieving the international cooperation we're talking about.
Thank you, Zipporah. Yeah, we have this rather strange situation where you have one government department handing out exploration licenses. And literally down the corridor is another department trying to work on the Paris Climate Agreement, as if the two are unconnected. And so you've got governments not really understanding both sides of the coin. The need to constrain production is the same thing as needing to constrain emissions. So when you ask governments, oh, you know, which fossil fuel projects are likely or unlikely, there is no public registry that allows policymakers and scientists and elected officials to look and say, well, actually, it's going to be these projects here that are going to tip us over 1.5 degrees or 1.6 and 1.7 and so forth. So the global registry is a core part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It will be a registry of projects under development or currently producing or have received a final investment decision or consent to proceed. And it will look at resources as well as reserves, what governments are planning. And it will not just be a registry of projects, it's going to be a registry of embedded carbon dioxide. We can estimate with a reasonable degree of certainty how much CO2 is embedded in those reserves. So it's a kind of a counting clock downwards. We can see which of the projects really take us beyond, and that will allow focus. And more importantly for the banks and the insurance companies, be able to say, well, look, these projects clearly breach the Paris Agreement. Should we be lending to them? Should we be insuring them? And investors will be able to look at companies, whether it's Exxon or Shell or whoever it might be, and say, look, those projects that you're planning to develop clearly are going to breach the Paris guidelines. We really need to have a proper conversation with you about retiring those particular projects and those licenses. And that's the purpose of the registry, open and transparent. Governments together, and they meet at the COP, will be able to look each year at this registry and say, okay, this is a hot water test. Are we getting cooler? Or are we getting warmer? And based on the fact that we're still investing $1 trillion a year, according to the IEA, into new fossil fuel infrastructure, it will actually, it's a warning to the world that we're really heading in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Mark. And just a note for journalists, there is a white paper on the global fossil fuel registry proposal that you can find at fossilfueltreaty.org. Also, a couple of other resources, the production gap report, which you heard about today from IASD at productiongap.org, a policy paper from the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice on Not Zero, and of course the Energy Policy Tracker tracking stimulus funding, which can also provide significant information as we review how to increase climate ambition in the run-up to this weekend's UK Climate Summit. So what we've heard today is clearly that it is an urgent need from many places in the world, places that are already experiencing severe climate impacts, from the Philippines to the Amazon, to Malaysia, to many countries in Africa, to stop the expansion of fossil fuel production, to get on track to meet the goals of the Paris Accord. In order to do that, we need action and leadership at all levels, from the financial community to our governments. We need new international cooperation to constrain the production of fossil fuels and ensure that wealthy countries lead in ensuring an equitable phase out of fossil fuels, a global disarmament, a phase out of existing stockpiles, and a peaceful transition away from fossil fuel production. It's been an honor to moderate this panel this morning. Incredible speakers. There will be a recording of this panel posted at fossilfueltreaty.org. A number of questions in the chat we were unable to get to about the initiative, the campaign, how people can engage, what the next steps are in the treaty initiative. I urge you to go to fossilfueltreaty.org. If you scroll down, there is also a campaign hub where you can join and get more information for the campaign. I really want to thank all of our incredible panelists and wish you well and safe at this time. And to the decision makers who are gathering and will be working in the coming year in the run-up to COP26. This is a moment that requires your leadership and your courage. Every ton matters. And the amazing thing that we've learned from the youth leaders on this call, from youth around the world, and the Indigenous leadership, the persistent and dedicated Indigenous leadership fighting against all odds to protect their lands, that courage can be contagious. And that's certainly what we need at this moment in history. Thank you for joining this webinar. Again, thank you to all of our excellent panelists and to everyone in their homes around the world. Stay safe.